Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Wednesday study session that still, after 9 years, we don't have a name for. We're so thrilled to be back after taking a week off. The schedule is out. We'll be meeting every week we won't be meeting the next 2 weeks. Then we'll meet 2 weeks, and I'll be off August 11th, and then we'll meet the rest of August. And then September, we have to decide if we want to switch the day, because Wednesday's pretty much taken by these high holidays, just get in the way of everything. And then we'll start in October with a once a month in-person session, and we'll continue the everyday virtual, but even the in-person stuff will be virtually streamed as well. I'll bring my computer and we'll virtually stream that. So the schedule's out, although if people want to make changes, no worries. We can easily make changes, but I think it's a good schedule. I took all of the ideas that you gave and then just put them in an order. And then I realized I made a mistake or two, so I resent it out. Any thoughts or questions before we begin today on a really interesting topic, one that is a little more mysterious than most people realize? Any questions or thoughts? All right, again, if you have anything else we want to do, just let me know. We can put it on the calendar easily. So what was decided that we would do now is talk a little bit about the history of the synagogue, and then eventually we will go and talk about various synagogues, including Mikveh Israel, look at the architecture and the history. So we're not going to take pictures and look at pictures of them today. That'll be something we do another time. What we're going to do is just basically talk about the history of it. Now, of course, many people would say, well, the history of the synagogue should be pretty obvious because of archaeological data, because of the Talmud, because of other things. The funny thing is, we do not know at all when the synagogue started. We have records going back to old synagogues, but we don't know when the first synagogue was founded. There's a variety of thoughts that we'll go over, but we really don't know. And it makes it a little bit more interesting, I think, when it's so mysterious. So we do know what the oldest synagogue we have on record is. And the oldest synagogue we have that we can prove is from the 3rd century BCE. So pretty long time ago. That is the oldest one. It's in Egypt. We'll talk about that a little bit probably when we talk about old and ancient synagogues. It doesn't exist anymore, but it is basically there is a marker on a wall that this synagogue is dedicated to this particular leader of Egypt. And so that is the oldest one we have on record that can be officially proven to have existed. Nobody believes it's the first one. It's just the oldest one we have proof of, or clear evidence. So when did the synagogue then start? It's not mentioned in the Bible at all. Maybe some loose references in the later books, but it's not mentioned early on. So there's no record up to the destruction of the temple. That doesn't mean they didn't have them. It means there's no record. So there's a couple periods that people think were the moments when the synagogue as a structure began. Now remember, in ancient times, there was a central location called the temple, ancient temple, a holy temple. For those in the north, for a short 200 years or so, there was a holy site in the country of what was at that point Israel. And then there was a holy site in the country. Remember, there's 2 Jewish kingdoms at one point. The north was Israel, the south Judah. Judah, the holy site was Israel. And the north, they had their own holy site. And remember, the synagogue we think of today is a place of worship. So when we talk about synagogue, we don't talk about a place of assembly, because that's what it actually means in Greek. We talk about a beit tefillah, a house of prayer. So when did it arrive? So it has to really coincide or come after the idea of prayer is established. You can't have a synagogue where you pray until prayer has been created. So they have to really go back, scholars, and figure out what is the time period in which we think prayer was created. Now, remember, worship was centralized at these temples where they sacrificed. So in order to find the earliest synagogue, the most obvious answer would be, at what period did they not have access to a place to sacrifice? When did sacrifice stop? Or when was there a moment when it wasn't available? So obviously sacrifice stopped in the year 70 CE after the destruction of the temple. So the temple is destroyed in the year 70. No more places to sacrifice. Worship takes over and the synagogues take over. However, we know there were synagogues in the 3rd century BC. So we know there were synagogues 250, 300 years, maybe more, that we can prove before the year 70. So we know there was prayer before sacrifice stopped. So the most obvious place to look at where prayer came from would be, what moment in time were we not able to sacrifice first? And when is the first moment where we can't sacrifice? It is the destruction of the first temple in the year 586. So in the year 586, the first temple is destroyed.
Okay.
And you now have two groups of Jews. You have the group of Jews that are taken in captivity to Babylon, and you have the group of Jews that stayed in the country of Judah. So you have Jews now in Babylon and Judah, and both groups do not have access to the Holy Temple. The group in Judah, obviously, the temple's been destroyed. The group in Babylon, they're in Babylon, they can't get to the temple. We do not know what they did in Babylon at all. We have no records really of what goes on in Babylon. So did they create the synagogue in Babylon and worship there? It is a distinct possibility, but there is no evidence because we have very little records of what they did during this period in Babylon. So that could have been one place, that it was developed in the 6th century BCE in Babylon. The other obvious answer would have been it was developed at the same time in Israel, where the synagogue had been destroyed. So those are two of the more prominent places people believe that it was developed. So again, 6th century in Babylon or Israel are two of the places where they think it was developed, even though we don't have proof of either. Any questions or thoughts yet?
Rabbi, just going back in history now, Nebuchadnezzar, was the Babylon, right?
Yeah, he's the one who destroyed the temple, the first temple.
The first temple, and he exiled the Jews from the north.
Well, no,
That was
the Jews in the north had already been defeated and had come south already.
Oh, they had come south already. I thought that was the exile of the 10 tribes, 10 of the 12 tribes were the northern tribes.
No, that was by the Assyrians. That was by Sennacherib, whatever you pronounce his name.
Okay.
That was in 722. So in 722, the 10 tribes are lost. Probably what happened is some of them got lost in the Assyrian Empire, and many of them moved to the south to the country of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar is the Babylonian leader who destroys this temple in 586, 587.
Oh, 100 years or so later.
About 150 years later, yeah, 140 years later. So,
okay. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was, I guess, viewed sort of benevolently in that he allowed the Jews to worship, as far as we know, pretty well in Babylon, even though they're crying by Babylon. The stories I've heard are kind of conflicting because you hear by the waters of Babylon, they're crying, and, they've heard the opera Nabucco and stuff like that. And yet a lot of the stories seem to be that the Jews were well received even in Babylon. And, the Babylonian, what is it called? The text, is written there.
right. Well, that is a good question, and it's really a dichotomy we have with this man. You know, this is the man who's considered by many the greatest of the ancient Babylonian emperors or kings, and there were a lot of them. So he did destroy the first temple. However, the Jews of the country had rebelled against him, against the advice of prophets like, who's the second major prophet? Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah, thank you. So king had been begged not to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, and he did it anyway. So Nebuchadnezzar did destroy the first temple. However, we have to understand there was a major difference between the Babylonian and Nebuchadnezzar's view of the captured people and the Assyrian who came before. And I'm sorry, it's a little complicated. In 722, the Syrians conquer the north. They conquer Israel. The Assyrians had a view that if you conquered a nation, you would take all the people and you would spread them out so they'd be assimilated into your empire and they would lose their connection to each other. That's why those 10 tribes are lost. They were spread out. You did not get to go with your group of people. When the Babylonians conquered a country, they did the opposite. They took all the main leaders of that country and they brought them into Babylon and let them be together. And then eventually, and that was the big difference there. So when Nebuchadnezzar did destroy the temple and take Judah, he took the leadership into Babylon and they stayed together. We don't know the specifics too much. We have we have references from Isaiah and from other prophets, but we do know they were together. And so because they were together, they were able to keep Judaism alive. And this is where some people think the synagogue might have been developed, was with this group of people living in the Babylonian captivity. Now, Isaiah basically says house of prayer, referencing the Temple of Jerusalem. So we already have this idea of prayer as the word. We don't know if he means the same thing. So we do know the word prayer in a form we believe means prayer is found in Isaiah, referring to the temple at Jerusalem that's going to be rebuilt after the destruction. So now, why would prayer be established in Babylon more logically than in Judah, because in Judah, the Jews stayed there? Well, the Jews who went to Babylon were the elite, the establishment, the educated, the wealthy, the professionals. And so you would think that the area in which they were more educated would be the place where the synagogue was first developed. So that's one of the thoughts. Now, Ezekiel also has a reference to something called the little sanctuary. And Ezekiel is during this period as well, saying that the Jews who remained in Judah had a little sanctuary. Does that mean that's the synagogue where they're praying? Does that mean they're sacrificing there? We do not have records as to what is what. So these are two options. One in the 6th century in Babylon and one in the 6th century in Judah. The one in Babylon would have been by the elite of the Jews who had moved there. And the ones in Israel and Judah would have been the kind of the lesser people, not lesser people, but not the establishment. So, any questions so far?
Yeah. Why would we even think that there would have been sacrifices in Babylon. The ritual, the sacrificial rituals were so well laid out. If you didn't have the temple, you couldn't really follow all those rituals. So
That's a great question. You have to remember, by the time of the destruction of the temple, all sacrifices had been set in the temple. You're only supposed to sacrifice in the temple. That was the rule. However, when you read the books of Kings and Samuel, you will see that at different periods, kings followed that rule, and at other periods, they didn't. There were large periods of time where people were sacrificing all over the place, allowed by the king. And there's really only 4 kings who forced the sacrifice in one place. Only David, Solomon, Hezekiah, and Josiah. So only 4 kings over a period of 425 years said you can only sacrifice in the temple because that's what God tells us. The other kings were a lot more liberal and weren't quite as coordinated and probably not as believing in one God. So at the time of the destruction of the first temple, most sacrifice, we believe, was being done at the temple because Josiah had just been king fairly recently. But it's very easy to see how in Babylon they would have gone back to sacrifices other places when they didn't have access. But again, there's no proof one way or the other. We really have very little about what's in Babylon. Obviously, we have a story here or there, like, that's like the Book of Esther, but nothing that is, and there is, of course, the famous stele of the Jews being forced to leave Judah. So we have that. Any other questions, by the way?
Could you just kind of complete the story now with when did the Jews return from the exile in Babylon, and why do you think Nebuchadnezzar or whoever was the king at the time allowed them to return?
Well, that's a good question. So you have to understand each empire has their own view of what to do. The Assyrians said, we take over a country, we take all the people and we move them all over the place so they won't stay together and rebel. The Babylonians say, we take over a country, we bring all the people into Babylon together and we try and teach them how to be Babylonians. The next empire, though, was the Persian Empire. They defeat the Babylonians and they take over what is now Judah. And the Persians had a completely different view. Their view was, we take over a country and we let the people continue to do what they want as long as they pay us taxes. And so when Cyrus took over, he came to the Jewish community in Babylon and he said, we want you to go back to Judah. We want you to rebuild the temple. I'm going to give you money to rebuild the temple, start your life there again, and start paying taxes. And that's what we want. And so Cyrus encouraged the Jewish community to move back to Judah. Most of them did not, but some of them did. And so when they came back, they didn't build the temple right away. It took some years. So during this period, they may have had small sanctuaries. They do eventually build a small temple, but it doesn't really become like the center of worship until like 70 years later when Ezra and Nehemiah come down. So there's a lot of holes in time where they could have created these first synagogues. Some believe they existed before the first temple was destroyed, and there certainly could have been because we have no proof otherwise. But it also...
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say, and then when the Romans took over and they appointed, the governor, Pontius Pilate and all of that stuff, he rebuilt the temple, right? The second temple.
He didn't rebuild it, he added on to it.
He added on to it.
That's-
Okay. And did they restore all of the attempt to restore it as they understood it was in the Torah? All of the practices with the priesthood? Was it, a total, duplications? Was it supposed to be in a large scale, obviously?
Right. Now you have to remember the Jews returned from Babylon in 536-ish
Right.
to Judah. They build a small holy temple in the year 520. From year 520 BCE to the year 70 CE, there was a temple there. So they had priests, they had worship, they had all that going on. What you know about the first century is Herod enlarged the temple and made it huge, much bigger. But they were already praying there individually. Prayer was already there. Sacrifice was already there. He just made the temple a lot bigger.
Okay, because that seems so antithetical to restoring the temple, to the Roman ideas.
Right. Now, you also have to remember, though, by the 2nd century and 1st century BCE, we already had the group known as the Pharisees. And the Pharisees wanted synagogues, they wanted prayer, they wanted study. So we already know that the synagogue, and we have archaeological proof, and the temple they were both at the same time for at least 200 or 300 years. So there was the synagogue and the temple for a 300-year period going on. So you could have your synagogues, or you could go to sacrifice at the temple. And they were competing with each other. Because we know from that very first plaque from the 3rd century BCE in Egypt that there were already synagogues built. That one was in Egypt. And we have records a little bit later of synagogues built in Israel, especially in the Galilee. So by the 3rd century, prayer has already become an established alternative. We don't know exactly how competitive or how many, but they're always finding new synagogues, especially when you get to the 1st century CE. Once you get to the 1st century CE, when the Romans have taken over, synagogue life flourishes because we have records from Josephus, from Philo, from the Mishnah, from the Midrash, from the New Testament, that synagogues existed. We had them in Tiberias. And if you go to Israel, you can see some of them. Tiberias, Caesarea, Nazareth, Capernaum, obviously Alexandria, but that one, of course, was destroyed. They just have, so we know by this time. Any questions, by the way, before we continue? I'll make sure. I know this is a little complicated, so I want to make sure I answer any questions. All right, I'm answering them all.
I have a question.
Yes, Noel.
Was the idea of taxing people for the purpose of building the synagogue or just lining somebody's pockets with money?
That's a really good question. How did they fund the synagogue? We don't know for sure, but it was probably not funded by taxes because taxes were going towards the temple and to whatever empire controlled Israel, or now Judea. So taxes were going to help pay the salaries of the priests of the temple. We don't know if they were being used for the synagogues, but it doesn't seem as likely, I think, because the people in charge were not the ones who generally supported the synagogue. The people in charge were generally the ones who supported the temple. And so obviously that changes everything. But we don't know. I mean, it certainly could be.
Just getting back to the archaeology for a minute now with Herod's temple, he enlarged it. He built the wall around it, which is what we have today, right? The
Right.
Western Wall.
Part of it, yeah.
the site of the Dome of the Rock, was that supposedly the site of the Holy of Holies? Is that what's in contention here? Do
It
we
is in
believe that that
contention.
is the major, the place?
You have to remember the wall is not the wall of the the western wall is what do you call the wall underneath the stabilizing wall? So the western wall is the wall to the platform that held the ancient temple. So here's the wall, here's the wall, here's the platform, and here's the temple. The Dome of the Rock is on the platform where the Holies of Holies was. They don't think it's in the exact place of the Holy of the Holies, but it could be. It's in the same section, but they don't think it's on the exact same spot, but they don't know for sure. So that's why Orthodox people will not go into the platform where the Dome of the Rock is, because somewhere in that platform was the Holy of Holies.
No.
But nobody knows. So it could be anywhere. So they won't go on there at all because there's a chance you're stepping on it. But they don't know exactly where it is. Now, the synagogue becomes part of the great debate, the great schism in Judaism that goes on during this period, especially at the end of the 1st century BCE and the beginning of the 1st century CE. Because you have two different strands of Judaism that are now coexisting. The strand of Judaism that wants the synagogue, that wants study, and that wants prayer. And this group is called the Pharisees. And you have the group that just wants the temple with the sacrifice, and this group is the Sadducees. And they are in competition with each other for several hundred years. The synagogues are all built by this group called the Pharisees, who are living in various places. And the Sadducees are the priests that are in control of the temple, or whoever's in control of the temple in the moment. So, as you can see, we know that these synagogues were already out there in places like Egypt and even Rome in the 1st century, because Jews had started to move out there. And the Jews who were moving to other places seemed to be more inclined to create synagogues because obviously they didn't have access to the temple. So you see synagogues in other places like Syria, Egypt, Rome. And these groups are probably connected to the other groups who are creating synagogues in Israel. The only place by this time you're allowed to sacrifice is at the temple. So that means if you want to sacrifice, you cannot do it in your home area. You got to go all the way to the temple. And if you live in another country, it's really far. So we're going to see this competition come to a head in the 1st century. In the 1st century, the Sadducees become very connected to the Romans who are running the country. And at first, the Romans are pretty liberal, not too bad, but they become harsher and harsher. And the Pharisees who want the synagogues become more prominent and more vocal. One of the things they're vocal about is not the sacrifice itself, but the corruption at the temple. It's in which we know is fairly true that there were a lot of corrupt priests, officials, and a lot of corrupt Romans who were there. And so this is where the contest comes in between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The contest only ends because the Romans destroy the temple. And the Sadducees had already said you can only sacrifice in one place, the Holy Temple built after the captivity in Babylon. Well, the Holy Temple's been destroyed. Romans are not letting Jews go back to Jerusalem. They can stay in Israel, but they can't go to Jerusalem. So since there's nowhere to sacrifice, this group has put all their cards basically in one place. And because they don't have it anymore, the Sadducees' power fades pretty quickly, and the synagogue takes over completely very soon, very quickly. So by 80 BC, CE, 90 CE, the synagogue is already taken over completely. Any questions? All right, I'm answering all.
That's right.
Now, what was at the synagogues themselves is a lot of debate, because we don't know exactly when the prayers were established that we use today.
That's a good question.
We know when they were established by, because we have excerpts from certain dates, but we don't know when they were actually established. Some would say, oh, Larry, go ahead.
I was just going to, Jane just asked me a question, which I'll pass on because I don't know the answer. Was there any attempt to make the synagogue more temple-like? In other words, have sacrifices at synagogues? Did synagogues have sacrifices, or did, prayers and charity and all of that take over for, giving money or
Right.
Instead of sacrifices?
That I don't know for sure. I'm sure it happened in some places, but the communities that were setting up the synagogues were generally the people who were not partial to sacrifice in the first place. But yeah, most likely there was intertwined all together as they formatted how it was going to run in the future. Because as we know, even though the rule was you can only sacrifice in the temple, we know from the books of Kings and Samuels that before the first temple was destroyed, that was not always what was done. And we assume the same thing for the 200 or 300 years where we don't have that much information, that they were going back and forth. So yes, very likely they were sacrificing in other places. But as it got later and later and the synagogue people became the people who were against sacrifice, that probably stopped.
Yeah, well, one of the main purposes of the sacrifices, just get back to Noel's point, was to, not only sacrifice something to God, but also to provide food for poor people and also to provide a means for sustenance for the priests, right?
Right, exactly.
But did the synagogues then I guess how soon after that, there was all lay leadership then in the synagogues? In other words, any
Is
sort of
probably what we call
leadership of the